On January 21, 1948, a woman died in Alabama. She was 105 years old. She had been born a slave. June 27, 1843, Montgomery County, Alabama. It is before sunrise. The air already sits heavy and wet, the way Alabama summer air does before the heat becomes something you can see. In a few hours, the fields will be full. Enslaved workers will move through the cotton under the direction of a driver, working from sunrise to sunset with only short breaks. Failure to work at a steady pace will lead to punishment. This is not a threat. It is a schedule. Somewhere on a plantation in Montgomery County, a woman gives birth. The baby is a girl. Her name is Eliza. She is recorded not in a birth certificate. Enslaved people did not receive those, but in her owner's ledger, the same ledger that records the livestock, the same handwriting that notes the cotton yield and the value of the tools. Eliza's birth is noted the way a farmer notes a new animal on the property. She is not a person in the eyes of the law. She is property. She has been property for less than 1 hour. She will be property for the next 22 years. Understand what the United States looked like the day Eliza Moore was born. There were no railroads west of the Mississippi, no photographs of any sitting president. The telegraph did not yet exist. The fastest way to send a message from Alabama to Washington was to put it on a horse. In Montgomery County alone, enslaved people made up the majority of the population, 23,710 enslaved people out of 35,902 total residents. Nearly 2 out of every 3 people in the county Eliza was born into were owned by the other third. Between 1808 and 1860, the enslaved population of Alabama grew from less than 40,000 to more than 435,000. The state was being built on her back, on her father's back, on the backs of everyone born into the same ledger she was recorded in that morning. Her father's name was Judge Moore. Eliza was his only child. There is no record of her mother's name. On the cotton plantations of Alabama, enslaved workers worked under the gang system, planting, weeding, or picking cotton all day long, from sunrise to sunset. This is the world Eliza grew up in, not as a metaphor, not as a history lesson, as daily physical reality, stooping over rows of cotton in sweltering heat, surrounded by snakes and insects, every day, every season. The cotton does not care that you are a child. It does not care how old you are or how tired you are. It is there when the sun comes up, and it is still there when the sun goes down. By the time Eliza was a teenager, she had spent her entire conscious life as someone else's property, in someone else's fields, in a county where the law, the courts, the roads, and the land all belonged to the people who owned her. During the Civil War, she was enslaved by a man named Dr. Taylor in a place called Mount Meigs, Alabama. She was in her late teens when the war began in 1861. Somewhere beyond the fields, hundreds of thousands of men were dying over whether she could be owned. She kept picking cotton. She had no choice. The war ended in April 1865. The 13th Amendment was ratified in December of that year. Eliza Moore was 22 years old. She was free. Here is what freedom looked like in Alabama in 1865. No land, no money, no education, no legal protection that could actually be enforced. In a county where the judges, the sheriffs, and the landowners were the same men who had owned her neighbors. The federal government had briefly discussed giving freed enslaved people land of their own, 40 acres, a fresh start, something to stand on. President Andrew Johnson canceled it. The land went back to the former owners. Freed black citizens were now completely reliant on wealthy white plantation owners for survival. Contract labor systems were put in place that forced freed black workers into jobs they could not legally quit, left them permanently in debt, and which often involved violent physical punishment. They called it sharecropping. Sharecroppers often lived and worked on the same cotton plantations their enslaved ancestors had toiled upon. Eliza Moore married a man named Asbury Moore, who had also been enslaved. Together, they moved to a place called the Gilchrist Place in Cordova, Alabama, and became sharecroppers. same fields, different contract. The only thing that had changed was the paperwork. This is what sharecropping meant in practice. You farmed land owned by someone else. At harvest, you split the crop, in theory. In practice, you owed the landowner for the rent of his tools, his seeds, his cabin. You bought your food on credit from his store, at prices he set. The debt accumulated faster than the harvest could clear it. You ended each year owing more than you started with. You could not leave until the debt was paid. The debt was never paid. Eliza and Asbury had 2 children on the Gilchrist place. They built a life there, slowly, in the way that people build lives when the materials available to them are scarce and the obstacles are structural and permanent. They would stay on that land for the next 65 to 70 years. Outside of Cordova, Alabama, the world was changing at a speed that had never existed before in human history. Eliza Moore kept farming. 1876. Alexander Graham Bell patents the telephone. Eliza Moore is 33 years old. She is on the Gilchrist place. She does not have a telephone. She will never own one. 1879. Thomas Edison demonstrates the electric light bulb. Eliza Moore is 36 years old. She is on the Gilchrist place. At night, her cabin is lit by a kerosene lamp, the same way it was when she was born. 1903. 2 brothers fly a machine through the air for the first time in human history, at a beach in North Carolina. Eliza Moore is 60 years old. She is picking cotton. The century is turning. America is becoming something unrecognizable from the country that recorded her birth in an owner's ledger. Factories, cities, electricity, speed, a middle class beginning to form out of the industrial economy. None of it reaches the Gilchrist place in Cordova, Alabama. The cotton is still there when the sun comes up. It is still there when the sun goes down. 1914. Europe explodes into the First World War. Eliza Moore is 71 years old. By the time the war ends in 1918, 17 million people are dead. It is called the War to End All Wars. Within 20 years, this claim will prove to be catastrophically wrong. The 1920s bring jazz and the radio and a stock market that promises prosperity without end. In 1929, it collapses. A quarter of all American workers lose their jobs. Bread lines stretch around city blocks in places like New York and Chicago. In Alabama, for Eliza Moore and the sharecroppers of the Black Belt, the Depression changes almost nothing. You cannot lose a prosperity you never had. Her husband Asbury dies somewhere in this era. She buries him. She keeps working. She is the only one left now from the world she was born into. 1939. Adolf Hitler invades Poland. The Second World War begins. Eliza Moore is 96 years old. By 1940, France has fallen. Britain is being bombed nightly. The United States is months away from being pulled into the largest military conflict in the history of human civilization. The world is being remade by forces, radar, aircraft carriers, the early mathematics of nuclear fission that would have been indistinguishable from magic to the people of Montgomery County, Alabama in 1843. Eliza Moore is still alive. She is still on the Gilchrist place in Cordova. She was born when the fastest thing on earth was a horse. She is alive while engineers are designing jet engines. She was born the legal property of a man in Alabama. She is alive while the United States prepares to help liberate the concentration camps of Europe. Hold both of those things in your head at the same time. On January 21st, 1948, Eliza Moore died at the Gilchrist place in Montgomery County, Alabama. She was 105 years old. She died at the home of a man named Charlie Brown Jr. on the same land she had come to after emancipation. She had never left. She had been born into a world that gave her nowhere to go and no means to get there. And then she had spent 83 years of freedom on land that was still not hers. The year she died, the Marshall Plan was rebuilding Europe. The Berlin airlift was underway. The United Nations had just adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a document that stated in its very first article that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Eliza Moore had been born the legal property of another human being. She died in the same year the world officially declared that this could never be right. No national newspaper ran her obituary. No flags went to half-mast. No moment of silence. She was buried in Alabama, in the state where she had been born into bondage, in the state where she had been freed into poverty, in the state she had never left. Many historians consider Eliza Moore the last certifiable person proven by documentation to have been born into American slavery. The last one. Not the last to remember it. Not the last to be affected by it. The last human being whose first breath was drawn inside the legal system of American chattel slavery. The last person recorded at birth, not as a citizen, not as a person, but as property. She was born in 1843. She died in 1948. 105 years, one life. From a ledger entry on a plantation in Montgomery County to a world with atomic bombs, commercial airlines, and television, all without ever leaving Alabama, all without ever owning land, all without anyone ever giving back the years she lost, or the labor she gave, or the name she was assigned instead of chosen. Think about your grandparents. Where were they in 1948? What were they doing? Somewhere in Alabama, in a cabin on someone else's land, there was a woman who had been born a slave. She was still alive. Her name was Eliza Moore. She was the last one, and almost nobody knows her name.